Good afternoon and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Cameron Hudson and I direct the museum's Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this event marking 7 years of still unfolding atrocities against the Syrian people, and most importantly, an event honoring the heroic work and resilience of Syrian civil society that is standing up to these crimes. I want to offer a special welcome to the many Holocaust survivors and volunteers who are joining us today, as well as those from the Syrian community. I also want to thank our panelists, who've come very far, many of them, to be with us today, and for our keynote speaker, U.S. National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. As part of our country's national memorial to victims of the Holocaust, the Simon Skjodt Center works to bring greater public attention to atrocities happening in our world today, to advance our understanding of why these tragedies occur, and to make practical recommendations for how the international community can make the pledge of never again a reality. To be the voice of victims of genocide and atrocity crimes today that the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 40s did not have, and to apply history's lessons to these most urgent questions. Next month, the museum will celebrate its 25th anniversary, and the mantra of never again is being tested today like no other since our founding. When we opened in 1993, Europe was facing genocidal violence in the Balkans, while the seeds of a new genocide were being sown in Rwanda. As we opened these doors, Yugoslavia's capital, Sarajevo, was under siege. Nearly 500,000 people were trapped in that city for almost 4 years, pinned down by sniper rifles and mortar attacks. The world stood in outraged disbelief as innocent civilians were gunned down one by one, and as marketplaces were reduced to rubble. We watched as United Nations safe zones became anything but safe. And for the first time, CNN brought these atrocities into our living rooms in near real time. After nearly 4 years of anemic response, the world was finally moved when more than 8,000 men and boys were marched to their death, and the evidence of their fate, satellite imagery of these mass graves, finally emerged to the public. Today, the modern concept of besiegement can no longer be associated only with Sarajevo. As we speak, more than 400,000 civilians are besieged and facing near constant bombardment. Homs, Aleppo, Idlib, Eastern Ghouta, today all share this unwanted label. For these cities and their populations, the safe zones of yesterday have become the de-escalation zones of today. Except unlike in the 1990s, besieged civilians in Syria are being targeted with chemical weapons and guided missiles, not with bullets and mortars. And the evidence of mass killing is visible not in the freshly turned earth, but in the smokestacks of crematoria. And the knowledge of these crimes is delivered to us in a near constant and overwhelming stream of information that we now have to avert our eyes from. But despite these crimes and our knowledge of them, a principled international response to this human tragedy remains missing after 7 years. What is not missing, however, are those average Syrians who have stepped into this unfathomable breach as rescuers, as doctors, as aid workers, as criminal investigators, as human rights activists, and as average citizens, refusing to be destroyed. For their heroic efforts, the Assad regime has labeled them terrorists and terrorist sympathizers, and has reserved some of its harshest treatment and most cowardly targeting on those who have stepped forward to save lives. Today, we honor those efforts. And to do that, we are joined by a truly remarkable group of representatives from 3 organizations who are bravely serving the people of Syria. As we mark the 7th year of conflict, and we take note of the special roles of Syrian civilians in it, we must not lose sight of the costs of inaction. Today, the Simon Skjodt Center is releasing a recent Bearing Witness report on the crisis in Syria, which shares the title with today's event, Syria is the Worst Yet to Come. In it, we outline a host of warnings for how this crisis will continue to deteriorate and what policy options are still left to explore to protect civilians from a seemingly endless onslaught. To help us understand and grapple with some of these questions about what more can be done and what more should be done to help Syrians and end this conflict, I am truly honored to welcome back to this museum Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, the United States National Security Advisor, to offer his reflections on the administration's approach to this crisis. A graduate of West Point with a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, General McMaster has had a long and distinguished career in the United States Army. His command assignments include Commanding General, Maneuver Center of Excellence, Commander, Combined Joint Interagency Task Force in Kabul, Afghanistan, and Commander, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. He also served as a special assistant to the commander of multinational forces in Iraq and as an assistant professor of history at West Point. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General H.R. McMaster.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Cameron. It is an honor to be included in today's event as we mark the 7th anniversary of the start of the Syrian civil war and this year, the 25th anniversary of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'd like to say it's a particular privilege to be here with two awesome members of my staff, Amanda Rothschild and Howie Wachtel, both of whom have grandparents who are survivors of the Holocaust. Would you guys stand up, please, for a second? I wish more of you could know the extremely dedicated and talented members of the national security staff who work at the White House. They work extremely hard for our president and for our nation, and it's a real privilege to serve alongside of them. This afternoon, we're privileged to be joined by many Holocaust survivors, including Irene Weiss. Irene, it's so great to have met you here. Would you please stand so we can give you a round of applause? She'll share her story at the end of this program, of a story of courage and resilience. You're an inspiration to all humanity, Irene. It's a real privilege to be here with you. We are gathered together this afternoon on holy ground. This museum bears witness to the most horrific acts of evil and atrocity ever inflicted on humanity. The documents, recordings, and mementos contained in these walls provide testimony on behalf of millions of Holocaust victims unjustly taken from us before they could share their stories. Standing in the beautiful Hall of Remembrance here at the museum, we can still feel the weight of every human life lost. Engraved on the wall behind the eternal flame is the well-known passage from Deuteronomy. Guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, and you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children. The United States Holocaust Museum teaches the importance of remembrance. This museum tells the stories of beloved children, like 7-year-old Tommy Pfeffer, who was gassed to death at Auschwitz, alongside his 10-year-old brother, Jan Peter. It tells the stories of the righteous rescuers who risked their lives to save others, like Raoul Wallenberg and Oskar Schindler. And it tells the stories of inspiring Jewish resistance fighters, like young Hannah Senesh, who parachuted behind enemy lines with the British Army to aid anti-Nazi partisans and rescue Jews. As many of you know, Hannah was captured in occupied Hungary, interrogated and tortured. During her almost 5 months in prison, Hannah revealed no information about her mission. Eventually convicted of treason, she was sentenced to death. On November 7th, 1944, at just 23 years of age, Hannah was taken to a Budapest courtyard where she refused a blindfold. A poem found in Hannah's cell after her execution read in part, "I gambled on what mattered most." It is important to remember what happened to people like Hannah, Tommy, and Irene, because we know that these horrors can happen again. But remembrance is only the first step. We cannot stop at remembrance alone. If we are to fulfill our promise, never again, we must also act to protect victims and hold all responsible parties accountable. Unfortunately, today in Syria, we are confronted once more with some of the worst atrocities known to man. The war has now raged for 7 years. The Assad regime has killed indiscriminately, tortured, starved, raped, and used chemical weapons on its own people. It has attacked hospitals and schools, and countless Syrians have been arrested, abducted, or have simply disappeared. And ISIS has kidnapped, tortured, murdered, brutally persecuted religious minorities, and committed unspeakable horrors, such as burning victims alive in cages. The Syria exhibit here at the Holocaust Museum, which I first visited in January, details these horrifying crimes through photographs, film, first-person accounts, and other documentary evidence. It is estimated that nearly 500,000 people have perished since the war began. In February alone, nearly 1,400 civilians have died. The conflict has created over 5 million refugees and over 6 million displaced persons. So today, I want to tell you how the United States is taking action to protect innocent Syrians, defeat ISIS, and hold the Assad regime and its sponsors accountable for their crimes. First, like so many in the room today, we are documenting atrocities. The United States is declassifying intelligence that exposes Assad's horrific crimes. In May of last year, President Trump released images that we believe depict a crematorium at one of the regime's prisons, likely installed to hide evidence of mass murder. Our administration is also helping to fund the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, created by the United Nations General Assembly. IIIM's mission is to collect and analyze evidence of international humanitarian law and human rights violations in Syria and prepare this evidence for independent criminal proceedings. We're also proud to support the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. This independent and impartial commission documents serious human rights abuses committed by all parties to the conflict. Second, we are fighting. We are fighting alongside partners such as the Syrian Democratic Forces to defeat terrorist organizations. The coalition to defeat ISIS has now liberated almost 100% of territory previously held by these terrorists in Iraq and Syria. We have made immense progress alongside allies and partners over the past year, but we have more work to do. The United States will continue to pursue these murderers until ISIS is completely defeated, population centers are stabilized, and refugees can safely return home. Third, we are providing humanitarian aid to the people who need it most, the victims. The United States has provided over $7.6 billion to assist Syrians both inside and outside of Syria. We are sending our assistance in two directions: to Syrian refugees and to areas liberated from ISIS. The United States and our partners will not provide reconstruction funding to areas controlled by the murderous Assad regime until there is a political transition away from Assad's rule. Fourth, we are working to protect innocent civilians from chemical attack and to hold Assad accountable for using these heinous weapons. These past 4 years have marked another anniversary, the 100th anniversary of World War I. In the aftermath of that horrible war, nations came together and agreed not to use chemical weapons again. Assad's continued use of these weapons threatens to undo all of the progress we have made since the end of that terrible war. Following Assad's April 4th, 2017 sarin attack on innocents, President Trump launched a powerful missile strike on the Syrian air base from which this attack originated, destroying over 20% of the Syrian Air Force. Our actions sent an unmistakable message. Using these horrific weapons is never acceptable, and we will hold perpetrators accountable. The United States is supporting the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, in their efforts to compel Assad to fully dismantle his chemical weapons program. Unfortunately, many of these life-saving efforts to resolve the conflict, to defeat ISIS, to deliver humanitarian aid, and to deter chemical weapons attacks are impeded by the Assad regime's sponsors in Tehran and in Moscow. All civilized nations must hold Iran and Russia accountable for their role in enabling atrocities and perpetuating human suffering in Syria. Across the greater Middle East, Iran is proliferating dangerous weapons, fueling sectarian violence, and supporting terrorist proxies and militias such as Hezbollah. This regime proudly chants death to America and death to Israel. It further offends the conscience of every human being by denying the Holocaust. In Syria, Iran's actions have directly interfered with the efforts to de-escalate violence, defeat ISIS, and protect innocent civilians. Since 2012, Iran has provided over $16 billion to the Assad regime and to other proxies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Tehran is also transporting foreign Shiite militias and weapons from Iran to Syria on illegal flights, including on Iranian civilian airlines. Iran's goal is to secure a permanent military foothold in Syria, which would threaten Israel, undermine U.S. interests, and strengthen the terrorist and proxy forces that Iran uses to weaken Arab states and foment violence. We cannot let this happen. All responsible nations must take action to counter Iran's destabilizing activities in Syria and across the region. For example, the United States has taken legislative and law enforcement action against Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, and we continue to call on all nations to do the same. Anyone who cares about the plight of Syrians, Israelis, Lebanese, Yemenis, and all people in the region should also stop doing business with companies affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Iran uses its relationship with these companies to fund and facilitate violence, terror, and bloodshed. Sadly, Iran is not Assad's only sponsor. Russia is also complicit in Assad's atrocities. The Russian government has bombed civilian areas and provided political cover for Assad's crimes. Furthermore, Russia has done nothing to encourage Assad to ensure delivery of humanitarian aid, to respect ceasefires and de-escalation agreements or comply with UN Security Council Resolution 2254's call for a UN-monitored political process. From February 24th to February 28th, Russia conducted 20 bombing missions every day in the eastern Ghouta and Damascus areas in Syria. Russia has also repeatedly thwarted efforts by the OPCW to hold the Assad regime accountable for using chemical weapons. This morning, the United States, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom condemned the abhorrent nerve agent attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal that took place in Salisbury, United Kingdom on March 4th. The statement made clear that we believe that Russia was responsible for this attack, and we call on the Russian government to answer all questions related to this incident and to provide full information to the OPCW. No nation, Russia, China, or anybody else, any other nation, should be using chemical weapons and nerve agents. If Iran and Russia do not stop enabling the regime's atrocities and adhere to UN Security Council resolutions, all nations must respond more forcibly than simply issuing strong statements. It is time to impose serious political and economic consequences on Moscow and Tehran. Assad should not have impunity for his crimes, and neither should his sponsors. And if we needed reminding of the importance of acting now, we need not look any further than this museum's powerful exhibits and resources on the Syrian conflict. Just as this museum remembers Tommy Pfeffer, Oskar Schindler, and Hannah Senesh, it bears witness for innocent victims, righteous rescuers, and the courageous resistors in the Syrian conflict. This museum bears witness for Ahmed al-Ahmed, a Syrian child murdered in one of Assad's chemical weapons attacks. This museum bears witness for the Syrian civil defense, the White Helmets, unarmed first responders who voluntarily put themselves in the line of fire to save lives and rescue the wounded. The co-founder of the White Helmets, Munir Mustafa, with his colleague Radi Saad, traveled all the way from Syria to be with us today. Thank you, Munir, and thank you, Radi. Would you please stand up? And let's give them a round of applause. And this museum bears witness for Syrians like Mansour Omari, who risked his life to confront Assad's atrocities. Mansour was working to document the Assad regime's abuses when he was arrested and sent to a top-secret underground military prison. While in prison, Mansour suggested collecting the names of other prisoners. Like brave Hannah Senesh, the prisoners would leave permanent traces of themselves so that others might remember them and know their stories. Using their blood and rust from cell bars, they wrote their names on scraps of fabric torn from clothes. To hide the strips of fabric, a prisoner sewed them in to the collar and cuffs of another prisoner's shirt. After nearly a year in captivity, Mansour received news that he would be released. As he was leaving, other prisoners whispered 4 heart-wrenching words: "Please don't forget us." He would not. Mansour was wearing the shirt, and the bloodied scraps of fabric containing the names of 82 prisoners are now on display at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Every visitor who passes through the Syrian exhibit will know their names and remember. Today, on the 7th anniversary of the Syrian civil war, let us all promise to remember and to act. We will never forget the victims of the Holocaust, and we will listen to survivors like Irene. We will never forget the victims of the Syrian civil war, and we will listen to witnesses like Mansour. Preventing genocide and mass atrocities falls on all of us. Every nation and every person must share this responsibility with allies, partners, and like-minded nations. We are acting. We are exposing atrocities, defeating ISIS, providing humanitarian assistance, deterring chemical weapons use, and holding Assad and his sponsors accountable for their horrific crimes. Thank you again for the opportunity to join today's events, for the privilege of being with so many courageous people who are committed to the betterment of all humanity. It is an honor to be among so many survivors, advocates, and citizens. We appreciate all you do to bring greater awareness to these and other atrocities. On behalf of President Trump, it's a privilege to be with you, and we are committed to remembering, and we are committed to acting. Thank you.
الله أكبر. هلا اتركني طالع لي الولد ابو سطيف. ثواني عايش الولد. يا رب حجي طول بالك، ما في شيء باذن الله، ما في شيء، طول لي بالك بس بعد لي هي لوراه. اسحبه اسحبه طول بالك اتركه. يلا الله اكبر الله اكبر الله اكبر الله اكبر الله اكبر. 9/2/2018 قذف بالطائرات الحربيه على مدينه دوما. الله اكبر.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank very sincerely Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster for your incredibly powerful words. I think you early on said we can't stop at remembrance alone. What we need is action. And I think our guests here and the video that we just watched shows why this is such a critically important moment to reflect on what that means. A few weeks ago, I was sitting with a colleague of mine in Turkey, and we were talking to one of our colleagues and friends, Ahed. We were having dinner, and his 2 young daughters were crawling all over my colleague Janelle and I, and they were incredibly adorable. As we were talking, I realized that those were the 2 daughters that when Ahed told me that there had been a chemical weapons attack, a sarin attack in eastern Ghouta, those were the 2 daughters that narrowly missed being killed. His window had been open to their apartment, and as the chemicals came through the window, the wind went in one direction, and it killed their bird. Had the wind gone in another direction, it would have killed Amira and Judy, who at the time were 4 and 8. And to this day, they talk about their cuckoo bird that was killed. Use that just as an example of the realities of the horrors of the atrocities that are being perpetrated in Syria today. The realities that the victims are not terrorists as they are so often defined by the Syrian regime and by the Russian government, but they are innocent children, women, men, who are simply trying to live every single day. To put it in context, over the last 7 years, over 500,000 Syrians have been killed. More than 5 million have been internally displaced. More than 6 million are refugees, primarily in the neighboring countries. On a daily basis, they face an onslaught of the attacks that you watched in that video in eastern Ghouta. We should not have to be here sitting to talk about what has happened in Syria and what is happening. In the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, there was a story that was oft told of a group of Tutsi who wrote a letter to their pastors, and they said in that letter, "Tomorrow we and our families will be killed." Well, the one message that Janelle and I had when we left Turkey and Jordan from each of the Syrians that we met with was that today, tomorrow, and in the future, we and our families will be killed in opposition-held areas, and that the situation will only get worse as the Assad government feels emboldened at this point and believes that they're on the cusp of regaining opposition-held territory, and they are supported by the Russian government and Iranian government and affiliated militias in the course of doing so. This is a moment where, tragically, the commitment made over 70 years ago to never again, a commitment that many of us take to our hearts and believe should mean something today, has rung hollow. And I'm incredibly honored today to be able to have this conversation with our colleagues who represent a diverse group of Syrian civil society, who in the midst of the international community essentially abandoning them, have taken remarkable steps to protect Syrians on a daily basis, often at great risk to themselves. With that, I'd like to introduce our incredible panelists and highlight some of the amazing work that they have been doing. Munir Mustafa, literally 72 hours ago, came out of Idlib. He's the deputy head of the Syria Civil Defense. He's originally from Tal Karma, a town in northern Idlib, close to the Turkish border. Before joining the Syria Civil Defense, known as the White Helmets, he was a firefighter. Once the uprising began and the atrocities began to be committed, he helped to start an independent firefighting brigade. He joined the White Helmets in its founding in 2013. He studied electrical engineering in Aleppo and is married with 3 children. Rafif Jujati serves as the director of the Foundation to Restore Equality and Education in Syria, Free Syria, and has served as a spokesperson for the local coordination committees in Syria, the formal opposition during the Geneva peace talks, and the Syrian women's political movement. She's currently the chair of the board of directors of Baitna Syria, a civil society hub organization. Dr. Samar Attar is a surgeon with Northwestern Medicine in Chicago and a member of the Syrian American Medical Society. He volunteers with SAMS inside Syria and with Doctors Without Borders, MSF, in Ramtha at the Jordanian-Syrian border. We've had the remarkable privilege of working with all 3 of these individuals and their organizations for the last few years. The work that you're doing is truly remarkable. It puts yourself at immense risk. At times, it puts your families at risk. You do it because we have essentially found ourselves in a situation where you are left to be the protectors. With that, I wanted to ask Munir, you just came out of Idlib. And for those who aren't as familiar with Idlib, it is a northern province where there are around 2 million people currently living there. Many have been displaced from other parts of Syria, but also from within Idlib itself. It's been facing an onslaught of attacks by the Syrian regime with the support of its allies. Munir, can you tell us a little bit about what the conditions are like right now in Idlib, the daily risks that civilians are facing, and some of the work that you have been doing to go in and actually rescue, as you saw, that child that had been rescued from the rubble?
في البداية أنا بحب أتشكرك لحتى وأتشكر الحضور إنه أتحتوا لي الفرصة لحتى أقعد عندكم أو معكم وأنقل معاناة الشعب السوري داخل سوريا.
I'd like to start by thanking you and thanking the audience for being here today so that we can convey to you the horrors that are facing the Syrian people.
للأسف اللي عم يحصل داخل سوريا هو شيء فظيع جدا. اللي عم يحصل هو إبادة جماعية لشعب طالب بالحرية والكرامة مثله مثل أي فرد بشعوب العالم أجمع.
What's happening in Syria is a catastrophe. It is the genocide and commission of atrocities against a people who just wanted the freedom that any human being on earth yearns for and deserves.
ما يحصل بسوريا استخدام لكافة أنواع الأسلحة المحرمة دولياً مثل الأسلحة العنقودية ومثل الأسلحة الكيميائية لإبادة هذا الشعب.
What's happening in Syria is the use of all different kinds of weapons to silence these people and to commit genocide against them.
يستخدم في سوريا الطيران من قبل قوات النظام السورية وحلفائه للقضاء على كل شيء ينبض بالحياة داخل الأرض السورية من مدنيين ومن حجر ومن شجر ومن أي شيء.
Among those weapons, the use of an air force in all of its capacity in order to target civilians and to target all of the nodes of life on the ground from those areas that have sought to be in opposition.
ما يحصل في سوريا تطهير عرقي، ما يحصل في سوريا تهجير جماعي وتهجير قسري يمارس على الشعب السوري ليحل مكانه خطط ممكن تكون هي خطط للمد الإيراني داخل سوريا ولمد الميليشيات الشيعية داخل سوريا.
What's happening in Syria is also ethnic cleansing. It's the forced displacement of entire communities from their neighborhoods. And this seems to be part of a strategy by the Iranians in order to change the demography of the country.
كل الذنب اللي ارتكبوه المواطنين السوريين ب 15/3 من 7 سنين مثل هذا اليوم من 7 سنين انهم طالبوا بالحرية والكرامة وطالبوا انه يعيشوا بكرامة مثلهم مثل اي شخص موجود في هذا العالم.
All of these crimes that have been committed against the Syrian people from 7 years ago exactly to this day is just for one reason, because all of these people wanted to live in freedom and dignity.
أكثر من 500,000 قتيل داخل سوريا، هدول اللي توثقوا فقط، وأنا بقول لكم يمكن وصل العدد للمليون، لأن في كثير من المساجين، في كثير من المعتقلين عم يموتوا داخل المعتقلات وهدول ما عم يتوثقوا خالص.
Over 500,000 people who have been killed to this day, and those are just the names that have been documented. I fear that there are over 1 million people who have been killed because there are still hundreds of thousands who have gone missing or who are languishing in the Assad regime's detention centers.
كل عائلة وكل فرد داخل الأرض السورية يعاني من ويلات هذه الحرب. كل شخص فقد عزيز أو فقد صديق أو فقد أخ أو تعرض للتهجير أو تعرض للجوء في الدول المجاورة أو في دول العالم.
Every Syrian across the country is suffering because of this war. Every Syrian has lost someone in their family, has lost their home, has lost everything because of the crimes that are being committed.
بصراحة المأساة أكبر من إنه تنوصف بدقائق أو بكلمات. أنا حملني كثير من الناس لما عرفوا إنه أنا جاي رح قابل يعني جزء من المجتمع الأمريكي ورح قابل جزء من الحكومة الأمريكية إنه وصل رسالتهم ووصل المعاناة تبعهم، ولكن هذه المعاناة لا يمكن إنه تنوصف بدقائق ولا يمكن إنه تنوصف بكلمات، لأن هي معاناة كبيرة صار لها 7 سنوات.
It's impossible for me to give you a full description of what people are facing in minutes or even in hours. When my friends and when people in Syria found out that I was coming here to meet Americans and to meet people who represent the US government, they gave me messages to convey, but it's impossible for me to convey all of that in a few minutes.
أكيد أنتم عم بتشوفوا مقاطع الفيديو اللي انتشر مثل هذا المقطع اللي هلأ شفتوه، هذا واحد من عشرات أو من مئات المقاطع الفيديو اللي عم تحصل داخل سوريا، وهذا واحد من مقاطع الفيديو اللي تم تصويره ونقله وشفتوه عبر الشاشات وشفتوه عبر الأقنية، ولكن ما يحصل هي مقاطع كتير أو ما يحصل هي جرائم كتير عم ترتكب مثل هيدي الجريمة اللي أنتم شفتوها، ولكن حتى ما عم تتصور نهائيا.
We're sure many of you have seen videos like the one we just saw, which documents one of hundreds, which is one example of hundreds of videos that we've recorded. And those videos are just those that we've been able to document. There's still hundreds and hundreds of crimes that have been committed against the Syrian people that we haven't even been able to document.
The videos are so incredibly powerful because it shows the level of devastation and the ruthlessness of the attacks, the images of these children being pulled from the rubble. Dr. Attari, you're an American from Chicago who has gone into Syria to work with remarkable organizations, including the Syrian American Medical Society. There have been between 2011 and 2017, 492 attacks on hospitals. And from what I understand, there's been an uptick in those attacks recently. I was wondering if you could share a little bit with us about both why you've gone to do this work, but also what are the risks that medical practitioners, first responders are facing, given the nature of the violence right now?
Yeah, I'm American, but I'm of Syrian descent, and so when I learned of my Syrian colleagues, nurses and doctors who were being targeted and killed, I just felt it was part of my obligation to go back and help, and just a small way of giving back. And yeah, destroying hospitals is just another creative way of mass murder, because it doesn't just kill the patients and medics in the hospital, it kills all the future patients that that hospital could save. And when you work in a Syrian hospital, you go in with the understanding that you're probably going to die or you're already dead. And if you are lucky enough to make it out alive, then God bless. And my friends, my Syrian colleagues, everyday men and women inside Syria have been living this way for years. I remember one day a bomb landed, an airstrike landed so close to the hospital. It was a nearby market, and the hospital shook, and about 30 people were killed, and one child was decapitated in the blast. And there'd be so many people trying to get through the front door, there'd be no place to put them except side by side on the same bed. And when we ran out of beds, we'd place patients on the floor. And we were doing CPR on one child who was unconscious, and the chief surgeon told us to stop because there was a boy who was holding his intestines that were falling out of his belly, and he was still alive, and he was severely burned, and he needed to be rushed to the operating room. So he took priority, and there was a man on the floor with his foot lying on his belly. That was the only thing left of his leg. One of the white helmets brought him in, and the man next to him, his brother or his friend, a close family member, was clutching him, screaming, "Why isn't anyone helping my friend? Because you can't get to everybody. You can't save everybody. There aren't enough hands to help, but you can't be indecisive, because then everyone dies." And those were the everyday decisions that you're facing on top of bombs landing outside so close to the hospital. So that's the Syria that I walked away from. That's the Syria that I never forget, because you walk away from. I just remember seeing children who would show up with tubes coming out of every place in their body, their chest, their abdomen. I remember one kid who lost both legs. And when he woke up and discovered his legs were missing, he saw his knees flatten in his blankets. He asked what happened, and when he learned that he lost both legs, he hyperventilated and vomited, and asked how he was ever going to walk again. So that's what I walked away from. But that's what Syrians are dealing with every day. You realize all those people are simply being left to suffer and die under these conditions, and you can't stop it. And 30 people massacred, slaughtered in one day is just another typical Thursday.
It's absolutely horrific just to think about just how brutal. There's a tactic that's used called essentially double taps, where they will bomb a facility or bomb a location. The white helmets will come in and try to rescue civilians, and then they will bomb again because they know that after an attack there's a congregation of people who are trying to rescue. I mean, the sheer brutality is hard to fathom. And Rafeef, for many of us who grew up in the aftermath of the Holocaust and who really internalized that notion that never again must have meaning, watching Syria has really kind of gotten rid of any illusions that we might have had to a certain degree. I'm always struck by the fact that the resolve of those who are intent on perpetrating atrocities often exceeds the resolve of those who have a stated interest in trying to protect or say that they will protect. And I'm curious, because you did a report for us that's available both online and for those who are here in person, where you were looking at the attitudes of Syrians towards the international community, a combination of both. How did they feel that the international community has responded to the conflict, and what their hopes are for the future? It's a really telling report. I was wondering if you could share with us some of the findings.
Thank you, Naomi. As my colleague Munir said, it would be impossible to describe the essence of that report in just a couple of words, and it was almost impossible to write the essence of the interviews we did with the people we were able to interview. The summary of the report is a hopelessness that maybe some survivors are familiar with, a sense of having been completely abandoned as the international community has watched the atrocities take place, often in real time, and done very little to stop them, has done little more than give lip service to a commitment to never again. And so I would say that the respondents to our survey expressed their disbelief that the world would allow this to continue, expressed almost zero hope that anybody would come save them. And again, as my colleague Munir has said, and as Samer has said, today I'm alive, tomorrow I will be dead, tomorrow my family will be dead, or if it's not tomorrow, it's the day after. That is the prevailing sense across Syria. It's not just in eastern Ghouta, and it's not just in Aleppo or Homs. It's in Daraa, it's in Idlib, it's everywhere in Syria. We have the same sense.
And just for those who aren't as familiar, Eastern Ghouta is the area that the video came from. Over 400,000 civilians have been trapped, besieged there for years, without access really to food, medicine, basic life-sustaining resources, being attacked really from all fronts on a regular basis. And right now, this is the focus of what little international attention and media attention there is. And it's really quite harrowing because, as Cameron said, you know, I can't think of another conflict where there has been as much attention. You can go online and watch live streams coming out of underground hospitals showing what the realities are. And yet we continue to find ourselves in this situation, and I can understand why there's this sense of a lack of hope. It makes me wonder about kind of where are we in the arc of the conflict, in the arc of the commission of atrocities. There has been a narrative that many have said that the conflict is coming to an end. Our report says there is no definitive end coming. If anything, it will get worse for civilians. And it's not just, as you said, Eastern Ghouta and Idlib. It's actually years to come. The foundations of future atrocities are being set today. I was wondering, Munir, your organization's motto is whoever saves one life saves all of humanity, which is just incredibly powerful. And it's something that also comes from the Talmud as a religious kind of origin. I can't imagine that you and your colleagues thought that you would be doing this with your lives. You've got people coming from all different backgrounds. You were an engineer and a firefighter. I've seen that others were working in bakeries or working as accountants and then now have taken on these jobs to help save lives. When you look to the future, where do you see that we are in terms of the course of this particular conflict and the atrocities? Is it coming to an end? Do you think that a year, 2, 3 years from now, we may very well be sitting here having the same conversation if something significant doesn't change?
هلا شعار الدفاع المدني السوري أو الهدف اللي أطلقه الدفاع المدني السوري أو الخوذ البيضاء هو ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا.
The motto of the Syrian Civil Defense and what we represent is whoever saves one life, it's as if they have saved all of humanity.
طبعا هو آية قرآنية مقتبسة من القرآن الكريم تدعو إلى إحياء النفس البشرية وإنقاذ الناس.
It's also a religious for us, and it's from the Quran.
تدعو إلى إنقاذ الناس.
It calls us to save people.
طبعا الدفاع المدني السوري ما بيتمنى أنه هذا العمل يستمر، ما بيتمنى أنه هو يستمر بأنه يكون في جرائم دائما ترتكب داخل سوريا وهو يضطر لحتى يقدم هذه الخدمة ويضطر أنه يقدم أو يضطر أنه ينقذ الناس من تحت الأنقاض.
Of course, the White Helmets don't want to continue doing this work. We don't want to continue having to save people from underneath the rubble after these horrific atrocities are being committed.
بيتمنى الدفاع المدني أنه اليوم يوقف عمله قبل بكرة. ما بيتمنى أنه يكون في ضحايا إضافيين داخل سوريا. طبعا هن عناصر أو متطوعين الخوذ البيضاء هن متطوعين من كافة فئات المجتمع، نجارين، حدادين، خياطين، من كافة فئات المجتمع. نزلوا نفسهم لهذا العمل لإنقاذ الناس داخل الأرض السورية.
The White Helmets wish that today their jobs would stop. Today and not have to wait until tomorrow. And these are people who are ordinary people from all walks of life, carpenters, plumbers, all different kinds of people who put their lives on hold in order to save others.
أكيد الاستمرار بهذا العمل يعني هناك استمرار في معاناة المدنيين، معاناة الناس داخل الأرض السورية، وعندما يتوقف هذا العمل يعني ستنتهي هذه المعاناة، وهذا أملنا وهذا رجائنا نحن.
Of course, for us to have to continue doing our work, that means people are continuing to be targeted, continuing to be killed. And so we pray and we urge the world to stop these crimes so that we don't have to continue doing this horrific work.
كم من المدنيين السوريين لازم يموتوا حتى يتحرك الضمير العالمي.
How many Syrians have to be killed for the international conscience to be moved?
كم من المجازر ترتكب بالسلاح الكيميائي حتى نقول أن النظام السوري تجاوز الخطوط الحمراء.
How many chemical attacks does it take for us to say that the Assad regime has crossed the red lines?
كم من البراميل المتفجرة اللي لازم تلقى على رؤوس المدنيين داخل الأرض السورية حتى يؤخذ قرار بأنه يوقف الطيران من الخروج وقصف المدنيين.
How many barrel bombs have to be dropped on top of the homes of Syrians for the world to decide that the Syrian regime should not be allowed to fly planes over civilian areas?
كم من قرارات مجلس الأمن التي تتخذ في مجلس الأمن يجب أن تنتهك باستخدام الفيتو الروسي حتى نحن نقدر نحقق سلام داخل سوريا أو حتى نحقق هدنة صغيرة تحمي حياة المدنيين السوريين.
How many vetoes does Russia have to use against UN Security Council resolutions before we decide to do something?
شقد بده يكون في مجازر تطهير عرقي حتى نحن نوقف المد الإيراني أو المد الشيعي داخل الأراضي السورية.
How many atrocities of ethnic cleansing does it take for us to decide that we're going to stop the Iranian project and Iranian expansion in Syria?
أنا هيدي ثالث زيارة إلي لواشنطن وهيدا للأسف يعني بثالث مرة ما عم بشوف أي تغيير بالاستراتيجية لدى الحكومة الأمريكية لحتى تنقذ الشعب السوري لحتى توقف القتل داخل سوريا.
This is my third visit to Washington, and unfortunately, it's my third time seeing that nothing has changed in terms of policy to actually do something to save Syrian lives.
أكيد نحن بنتمنى إنه توقف الحرب حتى يوقف عملنا.
Of course, we wish that we could stop our work and not have to do this at the same time next year so that we could end the atrocities.
It's really quite telling that those who are enduring the daily onslaught have to be the ones who advocate for their own safety and security. I mean, the people who are literally being killed on a daily basis, you go onto Twitter, you see videos, you see children pleading for their lives. And as you said, you've come yourself to kind of repeatedly ask. It begs a question, which is that, you know, the Assad regime has been receiving assistance and support from others as well, and it's a question of who's responsible for the commission of atrocities. The Assad regime is, but so too is Russia, so too is Iran, Iranian-affiliated militias. I think at times we don't squarely acknowledge the fact that they're actually parties to the conflict and therefore have played a very critical role in shaping everything from negotiations to blocking Security Council resolutions. I'm curious just for anyone who wants to kind of answer to this, you know, how do we talk about protecting of civilians when we are dealing with a multiplicity of actors that are now committing atrocities? When you've got Russia, you've got Iran, you've got the Assad regime. Rafif, do you?
Thank you, Naomi. That's an excellent question, but I would say that the blame extends beyond simply the Assad regime and Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. And I would accuse the entirety of the international community squarely for its inaction. Again, as I said, our politicians and world leaders are perfectly capable of issuing condemnations, but not taking actions. And so we hear about indirect weapons sales, and those weapons find their way into Syria, and they kill Syrian civilians. We hear about sanctions and UN resolutions, yet parties to the United Nations are allowed to flagrantly violate them. World leaders need to take a firm stand. They need to impose consequences for the use of illegal weapons, including chemical weapons. They need to impose consequences with teeth, with meaning, to prevent further atrocities. Otherwise, to go back to your original question, are we at the arc? No. The Assad regime has been allowed and perhaps encouraged to act as it chooses, Russia has been allowed to act as it chooses. When Russia is guilty of dropping bombs on civilian structures, hospitals, schools, marketplaces, the world is complicit in merely issuing condemnations. Thanks.
Samar, would you like to? Would you like to share your thoughts on that?
I mean, I would agree with Rafif, and just from the attitude of the Syrians that I met, when I met Syrian doctors and nurses, the paramedics, when I asked, these are people that are used to dealing with blunt scalpels, sturdy instruments, anesthesia is a luxury. When you ask them what's one thing I can do for you, what's one thing I can bring back, and the response as a joke was just bring more body bags the next time you come back, because it was kind of like a morbid, sarcastic joke. They knew nobody was coming to save the day. They knew there would be no stop to the killing, and that wouldn't stop them from trying to save lives. But they feel abandoned. They don't feel attacked. They feel not just attacked by the Assad regime and their allies, but they also feel abandoned and neglected by the rest of the international community.
Munir, in a kind of practical sense right now in eastern Ghouta and in Idlib, there is an offensive that is going on right now for civilians. Do you anticipate that is something that will intensify in the next few weeks, months? It might be an obvious question, but I'm curious just for those who are watching.
للأسف الهجمة اللي عم بتكون على الغوطة الشرقية عم بتكون شديدة جدا وعم تتزايد يوم بعد يوم، وللأسف يعني كان في قرار من مجلس الأمن مؤخرا لهدنة في الغوطة الشرقية وبكل سوريا، ولكن خرق هذا القرار كان كتير سهل لأنه ما توقف أي شيء، يضل القتل مستمر ولا زال التقدم عم بيكون مستمر للجيش السوري، وحصار المدنيين وقتل المدنيين حتى داخل ملاجئهم لا زال مستمر.
Unfortunately, the killing will continue to get worse in the weeks to come, and we continue to see the campaign against Eastern Ghouta intensifying day after day. And what's more unfortunate is that the UN Security Council voted unanimously on a ceasefire, not just for Eastern Ghouta, but for the entirety of the country. But the violation of this Security Council resolution was very easy. The killing didn't stop, not even for one day. The killing just continues day after day.
اليوم الصبح وصلني خبر طبعا من زملائي الموجودين داخل الغوطة أنه النظام السوري كان عم يستخدم المدنيين اللي هن كانوا فارين من الحرب كدروع بشرية أمام الآليات العسكرية اللي عم يقتحم فيها الغوطة وعم يقتل فيها المدنيين وعم يهدم الحجر وعم يقتل البشر وعم يقتل الشجر والحيوانات داخل الغوطة.
Today I received a very disturbing and heartbreaking message from my colleagues who are working inside Eastern Ghouta that the Assad regime is using the civilians in the areas that it's taking over in Eastern Ghouta. So as the Syrian regime advances, the civilians in those areas are being used as human shields, and they're marching those people in front of their tanks, in front of their military, in order to be able to advance into the other areas.
فقط الخوذ البيضاء، يعني فقط مؤسسة الخوذ البيضاء اللي عددها ما هو كتير كبير داخل الغوطة، فقد 7 من عناصره في الهجمة الأخيرة اللي ما تجاوزت ال 25 يوم، وتعرض لإصابة أكثر من 40 عنصر من عناصر الخوذ البيضاء داخل الغوطة الشرقية.
The White Helmets alone, which is not as large organizations, roughly 400 volunteers in Eastern Ghouta. The White Helmets alone has lost 7 of its volunteers in Eastern Ghouta just in the past 25 days in this most recent campaign.
ما عدا اللي قتلوا من الأطباء والمشافي اللي تدمرت، وما قتل من السكان المدنيين واللي تصوب واللي تعرض لإصابة ما قدر حدا يقدر يسعفه أو يقدم له يعني أي من الإسعافات الأولية اللي يقدر ينقذ فيها حياته.
And that doesn't include all of the civilians who have been killed, the hospitals that have been bombed, the people who are dying simply because they need emergency assistance and they're unable to get even that basic level of care.
طبعا وفي هونيك تخوف كتير كبير انه يكون السيناريو اللي عم يتم ممارسته داخل الغوطة الشرقية نفسه السيناريو اللي تمت ممارسته داخل مدينة حلب، قتل وتجويع وقصف وحصار وبالنهاية تهجير قسري، فهي جريمة وراها جريمة وراها جريمة وراها جريمة.
And what we all fear is that what's happening in Eastern Ghouta will will be a replica of the horrific atrocity that happened in Aleppo, whereby the regime and Russia are bombing and starving and committing all of these atrocities against people, and then in the end, after numerous atrocities have been committed, they're all being forced, they will all be forced to be forcibly displaced from their homes. So it's one crime after another crime after another and after another.
And that would be repeating the pattern of the way in which the Assad regime has perpetrated the commission of atrocities for the last 7 years. It's a very intentional strategy to use atrocities to advance military goals and to eliminate those that are perceived as being opponents to the regime, with the horrific kind of reality that they will label pretty much anyone as being an opponent. Children are opponents, as we've talked about before. And you can see on the map the areas that we are discussing right now, also including Idlib. One of the things that you just mentioned right near Munir was the kind of forced displacement of areas that are taken over by the regime. And that's at times linked to a reconciliation agreement, a negotiated settlement. In the course of doing so, there's been a very worrying trend as well. We've got the forced displacement of civilians, of local civil society. That is a gross human rights violation right there. It's a war crime. But we've also seen civil society targeted, detained, killed, white helmets after Aleppo taken and killed. We have a number of those reports, and they are increasing, which raises really difficult questions. Syria, what we have seen in the last 7 years that's been remarkable is the emergence of an incredibly vibrant civil society. And Rafif, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the nature of that civil society, because it's everything from journalists to the white helmets and doctors to women's empowerment groups. What has emerged in the last 7 years?
What has not emerged in the last 7 years? Just for some context, Syrian civil society is a new development. Before the revolution, I don't call it a civil war, I call it a revolution for freedom and dignity and democracy. Thank you. Before the emergence of the revolution, there was no such thing as a non-governmental organization or NGO. There was simply a GO, right? Any organization was required to have a member of the Ba'ath Party on its board. Every organization was subject to the monitoring, the ever-constant monitoring of the mukhabarat. So civil society as a concept is relatively new in Syria and now increasingly in Europe and Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. Wherever Syrians are fleeing, we are establishing civil society organizations. There are initiatives that take place in Syria, things like training emergency rescue personnel like the White Helmets and others, organizations that train medical personnel, organizations that educate children. My organization, for example, built a school in northern Idlib that serves 500 students a day. I am one of many, many, many hundreds of organizations. I think in Gaziantep, there are some 900 civil society organizations that are legally registered alone. We have organizations like The Day After that is presenting a democratic transition, hopefully, one day for Syria. Or we have Beitna Syria, which is a civil society hub that empowers grassroots activities on the ground in Syria. We have political movements that have emerged, like the Syrian women's political movement, where women are realizing increasingly that we are the majority, that we will rebuild, and that we must have a voice in any political or military settlement.
One of the things that we note, yes, I think that is worth it. It's really remarkable.
Women.
And I do want to just acknowledge and pay tribute. There are many Syrian organizations here in the room today, and we are in awe of the work that you are doing and the work that you have been doing for the last 7 years. It's truly remarkable, and it does touch on this incredibly difficult conversation around just resilience. I was texting with Keynote last night, and I said, it breaks my heart. I grew up in what I call the kind of shadow of trauma. I grew up with family members who survived the Holocaust and know what PTSD looks like in a personal sense, what it is like to, over generations, have that in your DNA. And I wondered if you could just, each of you, just share kind of a reflection on, I mean, it's incredible how each day people keep going. You keep going into Syria, you keep volunteering, you keep trying to raise your voice, and I'm sure at times it feels like you're shouting into the wind. If you could just share your thoughts on just the uniqueness of the resilience. I think it's something that is common to those who survived the Holocaust, who survived Darfur, Rwanda, so many of the atrocities that are going on right now. Rafiq, would you like to comment? I know, especially in the case of women.
Sure. I think one of the things that has characterized the Syrian revolution is exactly that, resilience. Because I don't think there is anybody more resilient than he or she who has watched their home collapse under the weight of a barrel bomb. I don't think there's any people more resilient than those who have watched their daughters get raped in the streets because they protested. I don't think there's a people more resilient than those who will take their children to the hospital clutching internal organs. For me, the thing that characterizes the Syrian revolution and what keeps me going, and this is a little bit of an emotional story, but a couple of years ago, I went to Atme refugee camp with some colleagues from the LCC. This is before my LCC colleagues weren't all displaced or killed. And we went on a fact-finding mission to this camp. At the time, there were some 40,000 residents in the camp and 17 toilets. As we reached the camp, a small child, an 8-year-old girl, grabbed me by the hand and asked me if she could take me on the tour. And at the end of the tour, she said, "Auntie, will you come live with me here?" And I say this because this child may be dead. I haven't been able to keep track of her, but she is my moral compass. And so what I do is try to give her a voice and her family a voice and the millions of Syrians like her. And I suspect that's a similar story for the White Helmets or for the Syrian American Medical Society or for the literally thousands of other organizations that represent those inside who don't have a voice. And that is resilience.
Thank you. Samar, would you like to?
I always think back to the hospital janitor at M10 in Aleppo where I worked, because he was one of the bravest people that I met. When he wasn't mopping blood or body parts off the floor, he was lifting people off the floor and carrying them to the operating room. And when I asked him why he stayed, he said that he's just some guy and saw his community being destroyed, and he'd rather stay at home and keep the hospital clean than drown on a boat trying to get someplace where he won't be welcome, or live in a refugee camp for 4 years. And people like him taught me that the people in the hospital working there, that there are ways to fight terrorism and oppression that don't require guns and bombs and bullets. Sometimes all you have to do is find something you're good at and channel it and show up and help out and do your job. And it's those little things that add up. And there was another child I met. She was shot in the belly by a sniper. She was with her father, and her father had to send his 3 sons and his wife to a refugee camp in Turkey. And he decided to stay in Aleppo and send money. He didn't want to leave his daughter alone in the refugee camp because he was worried that he wouldn't be able to protect her, or she might be a victim of sexual assault. So he thought if he kept her by his side at all times, everything would be okay. And the day we met her, she was shot by a sniper in the belly just a few feet in front of him. And every day when we'd see her, he'd say, who would shoot an innocent child? And he would start crying. And she required multiple operations, and on the day she was going back for her 3rd operation, he again started crying. And then she peeked out from underneath the bed and just, with a smirk, said, "Daddy, please stop crying." And that's what I remember. Of all the horrifying things I witnessed, it's the people that I met and the patients that I met that spoke to that resilience. The Syrian people, Syrian children, it really speaks volumes to their resilience.
We're going to open it to questions and answers. There's 2 podiums there set up, so please come and line up. And just as we switch, I'll just ask Munir to just speak to that question as well. You keep going back in time and again.
نعم، أنا بس بدي أحكي فكرة صغيرة عن موضوع الصمود. أكيد لما بيكون الهدف كبير رح يكون الصمود أسطوري. لما بيكون هدف المواطنين السوريين هي الحرية والكرامة والعدالة والمساواة وتحقيق أدنى مقومات حقوق الإنسان، أكيد رح يكون الصمود أسطوري حتى يحققوا هذا الهدف.
When your aspirations are so high, when you've set the aspirations are freedom and dignity and equality, then of course the resilience will be epic. And that's what we're seeing in Syria.
طبعا أنا ما بدي أضيف أكثر من هيك، بس بدي حب أوصل رسالة أخيرة يعني على المجتمع الدولي التدخل بشكل سريع وعاجل لإيقاف الدم السوري، لإيقاف جريان الدم السوري داخل سوريا. كل يوم تأخير يعني عشرات بل مئات من السوريين الضحايا. لو أنه بدي أرجع بالذاكرة إلى مثلا الهولوكوست القديمة، لو أنه كان في تدخل أسرع أكيد كان في كثير من الضحايا اللي ماتوا بالمحرقة اليهودية كانوا لا زالوا عايشين وهن هلا بيناتنا. كل ما كان في سرعة أكثر من المجتمع الدولي وتدخل أكبر في القضية السورية، أكيد نحن رح ننقذ حياة أكبر عدد ممكن من الناس اللي عم نفقدهم كل يوم.
I just want to say one last remark, which is that it is upon the international community to act immediately, to have an immediate decisive intervention to stop the bloodshed in Syria. And I just finished my first tour of the Holocaust Museum here today, and I thought to myself that if only the world had intervened sooner, so many more lives could have been saved. And so it is now reflecting on that we have to all make sure that the international community comes together to save what lives can be saved from Syria.
Thank you. We're going to take a few questions and then conclude with remarks from Irene Weiss, a Holocaust survivor as well. So if we can just start, I think we'll take two at a time. Would you like to?
Sure. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. My name is Natalie. I want to thank you all very much. I really appreciate that you're not whitewashing any of the issues and you're really speaking to the truth of what's happening. And I also appreciate your squarely pointing the blame on the international community. I guess I would somewhat consider myself a member of the international community, but I'm not entirely sure, I guess, what I can do as a citizen or a resident of the U.S. As you say, you know, you all are doing what needs to happen on the ground right now, but also, as you say, it's continuing. You know, it's barely a Band-Aid. There's political reasons this is continuing. And so I'm wondering if you know of any good strategic targets, potentially for advocacy as a citizen or a resident of the U.S. You know, of course, I'm sure we can donate to many of your civil society organizations, which is needed. I guess in terms of some way to prevent or try to stop this at its root, as someone who's not, you know, in high levels of the administration or anything, but just as a citizen, but who also feels, as you said, an obligation as a member of the international community. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you all.
Thank you. A good question about how we can all help. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Abdullah from the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. In the discussion before the panel we had with the general in the green room, I want to quote him, nothing secret here, but when we talked all about working on Syria and trying to help civilians and protect civilians, one of the remarks that the general said and struck me actually that we would love to help and nobody has better stance than us on Syria and on the civilians. However, there's no appetite of the American people because of the legacy of Iraq war. Nobody wants us to see us intervening elsewhere. Nobody wants to see our troops being deployed overseas and going to other war. Although nobody is really requesting us to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops to occupy Syria or to liberate Syria. What can we do with you, with the Holocaust Museum, with everybody here, to make the case for the American people? Actually, this is not about going and overthrowing a regime. It's about people dying, children being killed and bombarded day and night for doing nothing except challenging their governments and promoting more values of freedom and dignity. Thank you.
It's a very important question about how do we actually put the focus back on the protection of civilians and recognize that you can use tools in targeted ways that won't necessarily lead to another conflict like Iraq. I think we'll start with those two questions for each of the panelists.
Okay, thank you both. Excellent questions, and I think they're related. What can I do as an American citizen, and how can I amplify the need to stop the bloodshed? Well, you know, never again should not be a soundbite. Right now, it's just a soundbite. So repeat that to your representatives, repeat that in your writings, repeat that in your communities, repeat that when you go to your house of worship or when you go have dinner with friends. Never again. Never again. You have to keep saying it. You have to keep raising your voice. And as American citizens, we have the freedom to contact our representatives and say, I demand that you raise your voice so that never again is not a soundbite. This is one of the most fundamental things you can do, whether you are a young student, whether you're a politician, whether you are a civil society activist, or a doctor. I mean, whatever you are, make your voice heard. I think this is one thing we need to do. Muhammad, to your question, I heard the good general speak, and I paid close attention. And what I do not hear from the American commitment to save lives is the willingness to put an end to the barrel bombs, and a willingness to put an end to the chemical weapons and the cluster bombs, and now the crematoriums. I don't hear a political will to intervene and stop the bloodshed. We talk about a political solution. Tell me what the political solution is when you have Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, North Korean weapons, Chinese weapons, German weapons coming in to kill civilians. What kind of political solution is that? So again, make your voices heard, because never again is important.
Munir.
هلا أنا بدي أتكلم بالنسبة للسؤال اللي سألته. هي حكت عن موضوع التبرعات، ممكن إيش نقدم فيه، فحكت إنه ممكن يقدموا يعني تبرعات. هلا التبرعات اللي ممكن تتقدم من كافة شعوب العالم للشعب السوري أو للمنظمات المجتمع المدني، أكيد هي رح تساهم برفع معاناة عن الشعب السوري، ولكن هي تعامل مع النتائج. التبرعات هي تعامل مع النتائج.
On the first question, in terms of what Americans can do, and there was a note made about the fact that there can be people can support the civil society organizations and contribute to support the work that we're doing. But I just want to make it very clear that supporting our organizations is only dealing with the results or the symptoms of the conflict.
ولكن العمل الأكبر اللي ممكن نحن أو ممكن الشعوب حول العالم تقوم فيه هو الضغط على حكوماتها لإيقاف الأسباب التي تؤدي إلى هذه النتائج. كل الحكومات هي ناتجة عن شرائح المجتمع الموجودة داخل هذه البلدان، وهذه الحكومات ممكن يأثر فيها شعوبها عن طريق الضغط على هذه الحكومات لإيقاف القتل في سوريا. فلما نوقف الأسباب نحن بجوز ما نحتاج بقى للتبرعات حتى نشتغل على النتائج.
And if people around the world, instead of just giving money to support these organizations, but they come together and they urge their governments and they pressure their governments to actually stop this and to stop the cause of this conflict, then we won't need the contributions to support the civil society organizations and to support the relief work.
هلا بالنسبة لسؤال الأستاذ محمد، أكيد يعني أتوقع إنه الشعب الأمريكي عم بيشوف المأساة السورية، وأتوقع ما بيحتاج لأدلة أكثر من هيك لحتى يكون له صوت وله دور ويضغط على الحكومة حتى تتخذ أو تأخذ إجراءات أو مواقف أكثر حزم لإيقاف إراقة الدم في سوريا.
And with regards to the second question, I'm sure that the American people are seeing the videos, seeing the horrific atrocities that are being committed in Syria, and I don't think that the American people would need further evidence than that to be convinced so that they can decide to ask their government to intervene to stop this.
كلمة أخيرة بس بحب أن نقولها، أنه الشعب السوري أو المدنيين السوريين فقدوا الثقة في المجتمع الدولي، ولكن ما فقدوا الثقة بشعوب العالم.
And my last statement is that the Syrian people have lost faith in the governments around the world and in the international community, but they have not lost faith in people around the world.
Incredibly powerful. We'll take one last question.
Hi, Naomi. My name is Lauren Homer. I'm an advocate for the Syrian people. I've been working since before the revolution to try to bring about democracy. The title of this program asks, is the worst yet to come? And right now, the worst is already starting in a little place that has not been mentioned called Afrin, which is a primarily Kurdish enclave in the north of Syria, although they had 50% of their population were Arab refugees from Idlib and Aleppo. So our ally, the Turks, has decided to ethnically cleanse and commit genocide in this area. There are 1 million people living there. It was peaceful until January 20th. Now it looks just like Ghouta. The videos are the same. Children are dying. And the difference is that Turkey's got more powerful weapons. It's got drones that are flying around killing anybody who moves. So I guess I'm interested in what our guests think about this, and also I just agree that we have to do something. Turkey's ignoring the ceasefire too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and for just showing the complexity of the situation on the ground. We do highlight in our report Afrin as being an area where there are atrocities being committed and future risks. Maybe just for final answers, I know, Samar, you also, if there was anything that you wanted to add on what Americans can do in this particular situation or to Afrin.
Yeah, I would echo what has already been said. You don't have to go to Syria to help out. If you're in healthcare or education or anything, if you're good at anything, there are a lot of good people and civil organizations in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Greece, in Jordan. If you're motivated enough, you can go there yourself and help out. And over here, I would reiterate the power of advocacy, writing op-eds in a local newspaper, writing to your senators, writing to your congressmen, because there really is no committed global political or public will to end the atrocities. And I hear all this talk, we hear all this talk about red lines and chemical weapons, but really the red line should just be that people are dying from every weapon known to man. That should be the red line. And that's what Syrians on the ground, that's the message they want to convey. That's all I would add.
Thank you. I think one of the tragedies has been that the Syrian people, there's always been a comparison. The Libyan conflict, and that's a reason why we can't act. Iraq, that's a reason why we can't act. I think the Syrian people are yearning themselves to be able to actually have a response that speaks to their own unique experiences and the horrors of what's going on right now. Before we turn it over to Irene to conclude the program, I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank very much the Syrians that we have been working with over the years. I'd like to thank the Syrian Emergency Task Force and Moaz Mustafa and his team, the people who we have been privileged enough to help tell their stories. Mazen Al-Humeida, a victim of torture, Kateba Bakr Aga, a victim of torture, Mansour Omari, whose remarkable story is being told in the museum right now. Our colleagues, Ahed, whose wife, every day he left to go do his work, working on behalf of civil society, said, "Each day you leave, I thought I lost you." Our colleagues, Joma Al-Qassem, could not be here today, but who recently went into Idlib to try to rescue his mother, to relocate an orphanage of children. And when I asked him what he was able to take out with him, he said he took his dearest possessions, which was his books. And he had 3 English books that he took with him, and those books included George Orwell's 1984, book by Georgia O'Keeffe, and Shakespeare's King Lear. There is a lot that you can say about what has been happening in Syria, about the commission of atrocities. There are some true heroes that have emerged from this horrific period of time. And those heroes are the Syrian people, the Syrians on the stage here, those who are doing the heroic work every single day to try to tell the story, to try to heal those who've been wounded, to try to rescue those beneath the rubble. And it's been an immense honor for our institution to be able to try to do what we can to share your stories. We believe very much that our role and mandate is to try to do for communities today what was not done during the Holocaust. And today, sitting on this stage, we don't sit here as Muslims, Jews, or Christians. We sit here as human beings that each have dignity, who are entitled to their basic human rights, but we sit here unfortunately also as people who are united by a common experience of having been either affected by atrocities personally or through our families. And I think to close, there's no better way to drive home how critically important it is that we do not allow the message of never again to simply be empty rhetoric, but that it must mean action, it must mean obligations, than to hear directly from Irene, herself a survivor of the Holocaust.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. When I see the photographs of the thousands of Syrian families struggling to survive and desperate to flee from the war, it brings me back to another time when my family and millions of others were stateless refugees with nowhere to go. When I was 13 years old, my family and I were first forced out of our home in Hungary and deported to Auschwitz, where my parents, 4 of my siblings, and most of my relatives were murdered upon arrival. During my 8 months in Auschwitz, my 17-year-old sister and I were assigned to work and live next to a crematorium. Day and night, columns of young mothers and children and elderly men and women took their last steps as they passed by our barrack. We watched them enter the gate that led to the gas chambers. My brain could not absorb what I was seeing. I thought that this place must not be on this earth, and that no one knew that it existed. If they knew, surely they would stop it. Much of the world did know about the persecution of the Jews. World leaders knew about Auschwitz and other extermination camps, but the killing continued. It is tragic that over 70 years later, we would be faced with a regime in Syria that commits hideous atrocities against its own citizens. In Syria, we see that innocent civilian population is dispensable. Assad sacrifices his population to achieve his war aims. Recently, I had the opportunity to meet Syrian human rights activist Mansour Omari, whose imprisonment and torture in Syrian prison, is the subject of an exhibit in this museum. As we walked together through the Syrian exhibit, we talked about what had happened to us. His trauma is still very raw. He asked me, how is it that I'm able to talk about my experiences in Auschwitz, and how is it possible to resume normal life? I told him it took me many years to be able to talk about the evil I experienced. This trauma will stay with me forever. After the war, we had nowhere to go. The survivors wanted to leave Europe and were willing to go to any country that would accept them. My sister and I were very lucky to have been admitted to this wonderful country where we had a chance to live freely and rebuild our lives. I am proud to be affiliated with this museum as a survivor volunteer and to take part in the effort to educate the public about the crimes against the Syrians and the civilian populations of other countries around the world. Humanity's vulnerability to hate and violence demands constant vigilance and readiness to speak out against those who seek to dehumanize and divide us. As a survivor, rebuilding faith in people and their institutions takes a long time, but it helps to know that some have learned from the Holocaust. There are people who believe that race, color, and religion do not set us apart, that we all belong to the human race. I want to thank General McMaster and all those speakers today who took part, participated in the audience, for their interest in this urgent cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you everyone for attending. We'd encourage you to go to the Syria exhibit, which is in the Wexner part of the museum, to learn more about Syria, where you can also learn about Caesar and the remarkable evidence that he brought out of the country, and Mansour Omari. Thank you so much.